Chapter 7, Characters and Strings, Part 4. Converting string objects to numbers. The integer class is part of java.lang. It's automatically imported into your programs, and it converts a string. It can convert a string into an integer. There are other valuable methods contained inside the integer class, but right now let's focus on parseInt. The parseInt method takes a string argument and returns its integer value. I think I showed you an example of this last week in the code walkthrough, where we collected user input using joptionPane.showInput dialog, and we passed that through the integer.parseInt method. It's a very handy way to get input from the user and integer input when you need it. The integer is called a wrapper class because it wraps a primitive type in some additional functionality. If there's an integer class, there is also a double class, double with an uppercase D, not to confuse it with the primitive type that has a lowercase d. There's also a character class, which is how we started this chapter to begin with, and character is a wrapper class as well. Another valuable method in the integer wrapper class is the value of method. It will return the value of the primitive type that is stored inside that integer object. And it can also convert a string. Sorry, I just made a mistake. A value of will convert a string to an integer class object. Int value is the one that extracts the simple integer, the primitive type, from the wrapper class. I apologize for that mistake. So to recall, value of converts a string to an integer class object, and int value returns the primitive type contained inside the wrapper class. Double class does everything that integer does except with floating point numbers, and the parseInt method inside the double class is called parseDouble. Here's an example. Assume we want the user to input how many hours they worked this week. This particular program calculates pay. We set up string hours, int hours, integer hours. We've declared a few more objects here than I think we normally need, but that's okay. Final double pay rate. Notice pay rate is all in uppercase, and that's to indicate this is a constant. It's not going to change. And the pay rate throughout the running of this program is 12.25. String hours equals joptionPane.showInput dialog. Notice when we use showInput dialog from the joptionPane class, we have to import it. So look at the top line in this example where it says import javax.swing.joptionPane. You must include that if you're using any of the methods from the joptionPane class. So showInput dialog, null, comma, the first argument is a reference to the parent window. Throughout our course, we will not be using the parent window, so the first argument will always be null. How many hours did you work this week? And then the user types in how many hours they worked that week. That's stored in string hours. We want to convert string hours to an integer, so we say integer.value of string hours. That will return the number of hours worked. And then we set hours equal to integer hours dot int value. I'm sorry, let me just point out that in this example we're using the integer class object, and we don't have to. If we put we could convert this by using the parseInt instead of the value of and the int value methods. We could just use parseInt. joptionPane.showMessage dialog. Again, we start with null, the reference to the parent window. You worked. Notice we're using the concatenation operator here. Hours at $, plus pay rate, plus per hour, and so forth. Notice how they've wrapped around. The line of code doesn't extend for 172 characters. They press the enter key to wrap this around and line it up a little bit better. Be careful when you're typing your code that you don't wind up in Never Never Land having typed beyond the 80th character. In NetBeans, there's a red line at the 80th character that'll help you make sure you know when to wrap around. So to summarize, string variables are reference variables. The character class is a wrapper class that can hold a single character value. Char is a corresponding primitive data type for the character class. Each string class object is immutable. contains the equals method and some other methods that we looked at, but one of the most important is the equals method. The toString method can convert any object to a string. Integer.parseInt is very handy for taking a string argument and converting it to an integer, and double.parseDouble does the same thing, but for floating point numbers.